All right, let's dive right in. Today we're tackling a massive and honestly a really controversial period in history, the Age of Imperialism. This was a time driven by a powerful mix of religious belief, raw national ambition, and of course, a huge desire for profit. We're going to try and unpack what really lit the fuse on this global explosion.
So, what was the main engine here? Was it this grand mission to spread religion? A giant game of chess for global power? Or, when you get right down to it, was it just about the money? Well, the truth is, it's a messy combination of all three.
And we're zooming in on a really specific window here, a period called New Imperialism. Now, this wasn't the first time countries built empires, but this wave was different. It was incredibly fast, way more intense, and it was supercharged by the new muscle of the Industrial Revolution. In just a couple of decades, the entire world map got a radical makeover.
And just to give you a sense of the sheer scale of this thing, think about this. In 1850, most of Africa was run by Africans. By the time World War I kicked off, that number had dropped to just two, Liberia and Ethiopia. The speed of that conquest is, well, it's just staggering.
So how on earth did this happen so fast? To really get it, you've got to look at the forces that were pushing these European nations out into the world. Let's break down the 5 main reasons behind this imperial gold rush.
So here are the big 5, all laid out. You've got the economic piece, factories needing raw materials. You've got politics, basically keeping up with the Joneses but with empires. Military strategy, of course, controlling key sea lanes. And then you have these 2 huge ideas, a cultural belief that Western civilization was just better, and a powerful religious calling to spread Christianity. These motives all tangled together, sometimes helping each other and sometimes clashing pretty dramatically.
And this is where it gets really fascinating. You have these 2 completely different justifications for expansion existing at the exact same time. On one side, you have the missionary impulse, which comes from a genuine belief in a divine calling to share the Christian faith. And on the other, you have social Darwinism, this pretty brutal idea that survival of the fittest applies to nations, making it seem almost natural for the strong to rule over the weak. It's this deep contradiction that really sits at the heart of the whole era.
That religious drive was fueled by passages just like this one, the Great Commission. From missionaries who went out to places like India and China, this wasn't just a nice suggestion, it was a direct order from God. They put up with incredible hardship because they truly believed they were doing God's work, bringing salvation to the world.
And then, of course, you've got the engine that never sleeps, industry. The Industrial Revolution created this bottomless hunger. Factories in Europe needed a constant stream of things like cotton and rubber, and once they made all their products, they needed new places to sell them. Colonies were the perfect solution. They were a source of raw materials and a guaranteed customer, not to mention a source of cheap labor. The economic argument was pretty hard to ignore.
Okay, so we've got the motives, but what did all this look like for the people who were actually living there? Let's shift gears and see how this clash of worlds actually went down in 3 really important places: India, Africa, and China.
We'll kick things off in India, which the British famously called the jewel in the crown. And they meant it. It was the biggest and richest part of their empire, a massive supplier of raw materials and a huge market for British factories. For Britain, holding on to India was everything.
But that control was seriously challenged in 1857. The trigger was something that seemed small but was actually huge: new rifle cartridges that were greased with beef and pork fat. This was a massive insult to both Hindu and Muslim soldiers, who were called sepoys. The revolt that followed was brutal and widespread. And the consequence? It was a game changer. The British government stepped in, got rid of the private company that had been running India, and took direct control. This was the start of the British Raj, the official rule of the British government in India.
Now let's jump over to Africa. This timeline is wild because it shows just how fast an entire continent got carved up like a cake. It really gets going in the 1870s and then gets formalized at the Berlin Conference just 14 years later. After a few more decades of conflict, like the Boer War, the map was set. By 1914, almost all of Africa was under European rule.
And here's the most incredible thing about that Berlin Conference. There wasn't a single African leader in the room. You had European diplomats sitting around a map in Germany, drawing lines that created brand new countries. These lines completely ignored the people on the ground, often forcing rival groups together or splitting unified groups apart. They were basically planting the seeds for future conflicts without a second thought.
And finally, let's look at China. Their story's a bit different. It wasn't about direct colonization so much as economic bullying. See, Britain was buying a ton of Chinese tea, and their silver reserves were draining away. They needed something to sell back to China. and they landed on opium. They started smuggling it in, and when the Chinese government tried to stop this massive drug trade, Britain went to war. They won and forced China into what became known as an unequaled treaty. The fallout from this was enormous. Westerners in China basically had diplomatic immunity. They could commit crimes and not be tried under Chinese law. You can imagine the kind of anger this caused. Eventually, all that resentment just boiled over into the Boxer Rebellion, a violent anti-foreigner uprising. And even though it was put down, that feeling of humiliation lit a fire under Chinese nationalism that would really define the next century for them.
So that brings us to the really tricky part, the legacy. The age of imperialism is over, but the arguments about what it all meant, well, those are still very, very real. So how are we supposed to process all of this today?
Let's look at one side of the argument that comes up in our source material. Some people point out that the British Empire, with its incredibly powerful Royal Navy, did more than any other nation to shut down the global slave trade, a horrific practice that had been around for thousands of years.
But, and this is a really big but, it's just not that simple. This was an era of shocking contradictions. You had an empire fighting slavery while at the same time treating its own colonial subjects as second-class citizens. You had powers dividing up a continent without even asking the people who lived there. It was just a world defined by these deep, deep tensions.
And anecdotes like this one really get to the heart of the imperial mindset. This British officer, when faced with the Hindu practice of sati, where a widow was burned alive on her husband's funeral pyre, didn't start a cultural dialogue. He just laid down the law. He imposed his own moral standard, and he had the power of an empire to back it up.
And this ties into an even bigger cultural argument that one of our sources brings up. The idea is that the West's strength didn't just come from its technology or its armies, but from its core institutions, things like democracy and capitalism, which, this view argues, grew out of a unique blend of Judeo-Christian values and classical philosophy.
So in the end, you're left with two fundamentally different stories about this whole era. Was it a civilizing mission that, for all its terrible flaws, did spread some important ideas about law and liberty? Or was it purely an age of exploitation and domination built from the ground up on racism and greed? The messy truth is, you can find plenty of evidence in the historical record to back up both sides.
And that really leaves us with one final big question. The lines that were drawn on maps, the economies that were built, the resentments that were created, none of that stuff just vanished in 1914. It's still echoing today, shaping our world, our politics, and who we are. The key takeaway is realizing just how much that past is still a part of our present. Thanks for watching.